Hello. Can you hear me
Hello.
out there? This is the RPG Pundit. Let me know in the chat if I am in fact being picked up here, because I can never tell. And then we're going to wait a little bit for people to come in from the notifications. We've got 15 people in there. Okay. There we go. All right, we are live, according to Chris Miller. So this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss of internet shitlords. And you'll notice I'm doing this on a Tuesday, which I didn't usually do, but as I mentioned, after the summer here, my Mondays get very occupied. And so this seemed like the best time to do this in this week. While we're waiting for people to come in, I'll apologize in advance that I've got some allergies going on here. I don't know why, because this is like very early autumn here, and you know, you'd think in spring for sure it's allergy time here. So if I'm blowing my nose, it's just because of that. I don't have a cold or anything like that, or the coof or anything else. But I've this whole day my nose has been totally stuffed up by seasonal allergies. Anyways, today we've got a special guest that we're going to be talking about their products and also about kind of a lot of elements of indie game design and in the OSR in general, I hope. Hello to everyone who's saying hello there. Hi, Bullet Catcher, Great Gold Worm, Chris Miller is already there, good. And Scrooge McDuck says he's picked up Sword and Caravan last week. Awesome book, 100%. Excellent. Thank you very much, Scrooge. I appreciate that. Let me light my pipe here, just give people a little bit more time to show up. We don't have a big intro video like Diversity and Dragons does it, because as you know, I'm very lo-fi. I don't know how to do all that fancy stuff that Double D does. Or for that matter, that Ryan does in Inappropriate Characters. We had an Inappropriate Characters episode this weekend on Sunday, so be sure to check out the replay if you didn't catch it the first time around. It was quite a good show. Which guest starred Chris Miller, by the way, who's in our chat right now. My guest star for tonight, by the way, hidden by the panel of concealment there, is Taylor Lane, who I'm sure some of you know from mostly from Twitter, I guess, but also I've done some videos where I mention them, and also I did a live stream once with what was the pen name? Aaron's ex. It's escaping me right now. But we did a very interesting live stream together, the three of us.
Yeah.
So anyways, Taylor, welcome aboard. You're coming to us from a hotel room somewhere in the depths of Asia, I believe, which is for you, it's very early in the morning. For me, it's late at night. So thank you for getting up early for this.
It's only 8 a.m. here. I mean, it's not early.
All right. And you prefer not to, much like a lot of us have over the years, you prefer not to show your face here for obvious reasons. You've made a few enemies over the years, I guess, in the a lot of them that are like, you know, kind of on the indie woke side of things, but also there's some people that have trolled you on the other side, the let's say the far right, for lack of a better term.
Definitely. I don't know. I'm not really a boat rocking kind of person, to be honest. I mostly just want to make my art and live my life. But you know, those sorts of people are inherently sort of fighty type of people, and if you don't, I don't know, they're easy to offend type of people. I will say that I'm not as scared of them as I used to be, partially because I've been around long enough to understand that these people tend to be more bark than bite, and tend to be very good at making themselves look really threatening online, and not a lot else. But also because a lot of these people have, at this point, self-destructed in one way or another. There was this one person, Twitter handle was Roses on Her Grave, Nora Rose, something like that, Monkey Paw Games. And they were obsessed with me for years. For just years.
They hated you.
Yeah, they just they once accused me of having Nazi superpowers that allowed me to have more followers than them on Twitter.
Well, that was your first cardinal sin, right? You were becoming too popular without being under their control, you know?
Yeah. Maybe just too popular without asking permission first.
Exactly.
Yeah, anyways, a lot of these people have, I don't even know what Nora Rose is doing with her life now. Not bothering me is the part that I care about.
There was this, I don't know if you knew about this, but there was this whole scandal about it, right? Like,
yeah. She used, yeah, there's some plagiarism thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's apparently the Roses on Her Grave was cutting and pasting material. I'm trying to look up who it was that they ripped off, but I can't find it too quickly here. That's too generic a username. I just get up a bunch of stuff about song lyrics and poems and stuff. But yeah, they were ripping off another indie developer's tables and putting them as if they were their own. It's been a rough year for the woke indie hobby side, because between that and the Zach Smith article, they've been exposed as really terrible people, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That their entire social model was always something that couldn't last, because a lot of their incentive was always to be finding someone else to denounce, to show that they were a good person, to show that they were worthy of people's support, both monetary and otherwise. And I mean, that's inherently a situation where eventually you run out of people to denounce and you have to start denouncing each other.
Yeah, it's the revolution eating itself, right?
Right.
We've got some comments here from the chat. So Scrooge McDuck says, picked up Sword and Caravan last week. Awesome book. I think I read that one already, but it's worth reading again. Great Gold Worm says, I'm excited for Baptism of Fire. Well, you know, I was kind of amazed by like the cover of my newest upcoming RPG. It's not out yet, right? Baptism of Fire was for some reason kind of leaked on Facebook. Somebody put it up there, and it got a ton of response, and then it got posted on, I think it was the Red Room that had probably found it on Facebook and posted on Twitter, and again, same thing, and everybody just thinks it's a fantastic cover, and it is. I mean, without a doubt, it's a great cover for what's going to be a great book, but it has had a big response, probably the biggest response of any cover reveal I've done for any of my books. So I only just posted it on my Twitter feed today, because before that I just kind of retweeted the ones that were already out there. Let's see what else we've got to say here. Chris Miller says, in regards to what we're talking about here, if you haven't received death threats online, then you haven't stood up for anything. Yeah, that sounds a bit like the Churchill quote, doesn't it? Except redone for the modern era. And
honestly,
sorry, go ahead.
I think that it's even simpler than that. If you haven't received death threats online, you haven't been online very long. You can say I like pasta and receive death threats online.
Yeah, it's possible. That does depend a little bit what circles you're at, what you define as online. Naturally, Twitter is a place where there's a lot of that, right?
Oh yeah.
Scrooge McDuck says, quoting, right, anyone with more followers than me is aligned with dark powers. Samariza says, RPG Pundit, why are creatures made from random doodles more creative than intentional creations? Well, I'm not sure that that's exactly true, but I can see that there can be a value to like, for example, I've got in the Gonzo Fantasy Companion a generator for random creatures. I have several different types actually in that book. And the randomness allows you to think outside of your own box, right? If you're just trying to come up with something yourself without any random element that enters into it, you end up having less of a creative span than if you input some outside influence that you then have to interpret in some way. You know, that's part of the secret of why divination continued to be practiced and was highly valued in almost every ancient culture, you know, because you'd think that would be like, well, if divination isn't real, then how would it work, right? But in fact, there was a study that was done about the relative success of tribal hunter cultures that relied on divination for the hunt and the ones that did not. And it turns out that the ones that relied on divination for the hunt were more effective than the ones that didn't, because what the ones that didn't rely on that did was to follow patterns that they had deduced of where the animals had been found in the past. And you would think that sounds really logical, right? Except that in fact the animals themselves also react to the fact that they were hunted in that place and they don't go back there, and so then that actually reduces that makes it more inefficient for you than the guys that are throwing bones and deciding a direction at random and ending up finding the game there, you know. So this is a similar thing when you're engaging in a creative process. And I mean, I of course, in a lot of the stuff I do, I make use of a lot of sources from history and things like that. A lot of the monsters in my games are directly taken out of, you know, ancient myth and legend, but at the same time, in other aspects of my game design process, I do make use of trying to input random elements, you know, and that's why generators work so well, because if you've got, you know, Cults of Chaos, you can roll the generator there. It lays out a whole series of points that you can then use to craft an adventure that you would never have thought of just by thinking out an adventure in your mind, you know. I don't know if you've got something to add to that, Taylor. What do you think about the importance of randomness to the design process?
Several things. First off, as you probably know already, the musician Brian Eno famously created a method called oblique strategies, which was a set of a bunch of cards that all had different prompts on them that were just random suggestions for how to approach a creative problem, because he'd find himself stuck at something, and he created it originally just for his own use. He'd find himself stuck on something, and he would need just someone to tell him, hey, do this other thing that's random. And even if it didn't make any sense, almost it was better if it didn't make any sense as a suggestion rather than if it did, because he'd have already tried everything that made sense. And they're prompts like what to increase, what to reduce, or what would your closest friend do, or state the problem in words as clearly as possible. We're not really talking about deep mystic ideas here, but this was apparently the secret to his massive creative success. I also, on the subject of the hunter-gatherers using divination, I have, of course, heard of that. And, of course, I'm fascinated by exactly that sort of thing. Actually, in one of my upcoming projects, I have a method for the PCs to engage in divination. But I have to wonder if one of the side benefits of them using divination like that wasn't just that they tricked the animals, but that they avoided competing with each other. Because if everyone's in the tribe is going to, or even several tribes is going to go where all of the game is, they're all going to be hunting in the same spot, which is going to cause conflicts, which is going to cause fights. Someone gets injured, group cohesion is reduced, many problems. Whereas if everyone goes to random places, no one's competing.
Yeah, that's possible. I didn't read about that in the specific case study, but that does sound like something that could also be a possibility.
Yeah.
Anyway, before I carry on with some of the comments from the chat, because we've now got 50 people watching, and which is very good. Welcome to everybody. But I think that's probably going to build up a bit more still. So we're going to keep going with some of the early questions and comments in the chat. I'm talking here with Taylor Lane, who was once an indie designer, mostly connected with the kind of woke end of the hobby, and then realized that they suck, and then got very interested in the OSR. But before I do that, I'm going to mention to everybody who's already on the chat now that this is, as usual, my live streams aren't monetized during the live stream because you guys have all told me that's extremely annoying. So if you want to help out and you want to kind of support the effort of my live stream work, then be sure to send me a super chat. Unlike other channels, I don't have the policy that I'll only read super chats. I'll read any comment I find interesting. But if you do put up a super chat, I will definitely read what you have to say, unless it'll get me kicked off YouTube. Okay. So New Mode said, how does it work if Lion and Dragon has inspired me to write a novel? Obviously, I'd never plagiarized anything, but the historically authentic style of magic is great. Well, here's the thing, New Mode. I mean, if you're writing a novel, you're not going to be using my rules anyways, right? You're just talking about using the stuff that I present in Lion and Dragon. And pretty much everything I present in Lion and Dragon is not something I invented, right? It's like all the magic in Lion and Dragon is from actual magic that was practiced in the Middle Ages. So I don't own that. You can totally use that in your novel, because none of those were things that I made up. Every single thing there, like including the invisibility spell that involves waving a shoe over your head, or the earthquake spell that involves smacking the ground, or all the weird cures that require bowls and incense and things like that, the alchemy, all of it, the astrological talismans, all of that stuff comes from stuff that people really did in the Middle Ages. And people have always been saying, I've already had the same question presented me in Baptism of Fire, that someone was saying, well, hang on, so you're saying this is going to be like medieval authentic adventuring in 11th century Poland. So does that mean that there's not going to be any magic or monsters? I'm like, no, it's medieval authentic. Of course there's magic and monsters. Everybody who was there believed there were magic and monsters, right? That was the paradigm. It's got everything that's in the paradigm, and the magic is the magic that people really did in that place and in those times. And the monsters are from the real Slavic stories of the monsters. The pagan gods are, some of it is a little bit, you have to take some license with the pagan gods in Baptism of Fire, just because they are there's so little information about them, right? But they're as accurate as I could make it. We have a super chat. Thank you very much, Ebert Twix. That's $5, and he says players themselves are random generators for creativity at the best of times. Yeah, well, in the game itself, yes, the player characters create a lot of random effect by doing stuff you don't expect them to do as a DM, right? Oda Manjiro, sorry, go ahead. Did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think a lot about players who drive the game forward and players who don't. There's definitely a sort of classic Pareto distribution of players who totally change your campaign and players who do nothing during a session. I would say that about 80% of campaign changing action is done by about 20% of players.
That's true. That same kind of curve you see in terms of players who will do almost nothing on their own initiative at all on the one end, and then you got the guys that are kind of in the middle, and then at the far end you have about an equal number as the first group of players who never know when to shut up. Right? they want to get it. They want to be a protagonist at every possible moment, and usually become annoying. But those guys are often also the ones that do stuff that ends up changing the campaign. Not always the way they would have wished it, you know. Oda Manjiro says there was a fellow on 4chan who made an OSR monster book based on creatures he doodled and then made homemade minis of some. Well, yeah, that's, I mean, if that works, right? Chris Miller says, I once saw a monster manual on Kickstarter made from a guy's 5-year-old daughter's drawings. Yeah, well, some kids' drawings can look pretty weird, I guess. Okay, what else have we got here? Scrooge McDuck says, been enjoying following the development of Lords of on Twitter, which is a project that you're currently working on. Is that right, Taylor?
That is correct. I'm currently I'm going to start playtesting on that soon. If anyone wants to be in the campaign on that, I've got 2 of them. Message me on Twitter. I'm going to be holding it on Telegram conversations over the internet.
And this is a playtest, basically?
Yeah, it's a playtest.
Well, I think we could probably... Sorry, go ahead if you have something else to add.
Oh, I was going to explain what Lords of was for anyone who didn't know, but...
Right, well, I was about to introduce that. I was going to say, one of the reasons I brought you on here is because I know you've been doing several projects lately, some that are already out and some that you're working on, like Lords of So in whatever order you want to, this is the moment where you can tell us a little bit about what you have currently going on. What are you currently working on, especially in the OSR, but also in general if you're doing non-OSR stuff too?
So I've got the Evil Undead campaign out. I'll send you a link to that. The Evil Undead campaign it's just sort of this fun little thing that is compatible with every edition of D&D, which more or less means it's probably compatible with whatever OSR system you like to use with your own home game. So you don't have to learn another system. And I know people hate learning another system. It lets you play a group of evil undead who want to kill everyone. It's a fun murder hobo-y romp. Kind of a diversion from the usual more serious, I read a bunch of history books and I love mythology kind of stuff that I usually do, but there you go. Fun murder hobo romp. I'm having a lot of fun with it in my home campaign where I'm getting to be a player in a game I designed, so that's a lot of fun. Also, I designed, I think I wrote about 90% of it while extremely sleep deprived in a Singaporean airport. And I feel that shows up in the final text.
So there have been a few other games, products that have you basically playing the bad guys. What is it about this undead campaign that makes it stand out, let's say, or what is the context of the content of it for people to know what they would be getting from it?
Well, I actually made a system for for how the world responds to the presence of a horrible group of evil undead murdering everyone they can get their hands on. The GM gets to roll every day with a very simple system for has everyone fled as refugees, and do adventurers show up to stop you? And if everyone flees as refugees, or at least about half of people flee as refugees, there'll be fewer people for the players to kill, which means that they can't get XP off of killing people. And if adventurers show up to kill them, they're going to have to stop those adventurers from killing them. And I imagine that, of course, because the adventurers show up more often the more that they kill people, or the higher level they are, eventually the PCs are going to have to kind of build a fortification, some sort of evil lair, perhaps, to stop the adventurers from killing them. Which I think is just some good fun. I also made 6 undead classes. So you don't play as a fighter or a wizard in this. You play as a necromagus, or a dead lord, or a revenant, or a vampire, or a ghost, or a necrotic ooze.
Excellent. Yeah, what you're describing there in the first part about the possibility of them being hunted, or people fleeing, or things like that. That's an interesting kind of mechanic. Now, I have something kind of similar to that I have it in Sword and Caravan, but I think I also have it in, if I remember correctly, it was originally in Lion and Dragon, which is the unwanted attention mechanic. So it has that, and that's especially good in a picaresque campaign where you're going down the Silk Road. That when you get into a village, town, or city, after a certain period of time, and how long that period of time depends kind of on the size, right? Because in a village, you'll be noticed a lot earlier than if you're in the big city. But if you spend too long in one place, there is a percentage chance that you're going to have unwanted attention from the authorities. And that percentage is obviously modified by a whole bunch of different factors, right? Like, do your characters look respectable? Do they have a holy man with them? Or does it look like they have like a spellcaster that might be some kind of servant of Shaitan or something? Or do they carry, they have like a monster with them, or are they visibly weird, and all of those sorts of things that factor in there. And then if the depending on the role, you can end up getting, well, you can, one of the common things that can happen is that you can be kicked out of town, right? But you can have worse things happen, and sometimes you can have better things happen, in the sense that maybe they'll just call on you to do some kind of a task or something. And those sorts of mechanics are really good elements to have in a sandbox campaign, as long as you're flexible with them, is what I've found.
Yeah, so I love reading new RPGs, and so I end up reading a lot of very weird RPGs, because once you read all of the normal new RPGs, you get to the weird ones. And something that I notice a lot is people tend to not realize that they need to put these kinds of GM-facing mechanics in games. I remember that years ago, I was a teenager at this point, I read Changeling, the White Wolf game, for the first time.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this sounds so cool. You're all refugees from extra-dimensional insane lords, and you're involved in city-level politics, and you're trying to like not be replaced by your fetch, and oh my God, look at all this promise of politics. I can't wait till I get to the part of the game where it has all the mechanics for the politics. And I kept reading, and I'm like, okay, so here's where the superpowers are. All right, that makes sense. I guess you'd all have superpowers. And then I was like, oh, okay, we're getting to the part of the mechanics where it talks about all of the contracts you can make. I wonder what cool, innovative mechanics it'll have for how to negotiate a contract with a cloud or a tree. It's like, oh, it's just more superpowers. Okay. Well, all right, that's fine. But I'm still really excited about the politics part. And then I get to the end of the book, and I'm like, oh, this is just the GM section. It's just saying make up the politics.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? And that's true. A lot of times that stuff is absent. Now, there is also the fact that one of the reasons that there are some DMs, I think, that don't like random tables very much is because of how many random tables are not very well designed, right? Because if you're, for example, even with like a random encounter table, right? If you're doing a random encounter table, you need to have that table have sufficient variety, and how much is sufficient depends on how often you're going to be rolling that table, right? If it's a table that'll come up, once in 1,000 sessions, then you can probably manage to do that with a D6, a D8, or a D10 length table, right? But if it's something that's going to be checked every day, it better have a lot of variety in it, because otherwise it's going to start looking like the world is just, running on some kind of a cheap OS or something. It's just repeating itself, So, and then when you're getting into even more complicated stuff, like what you were talking about there, or what you're talking about in the way people will react to the undead in your game, or to the unwanted attention in Sword and Caravan. One of the problems is that a lot of designers don't, that's really hard to work out and figure out how to make it good, right? Because the half of the attempts to do stuff like that end up being bad, often in the sense that they're either incoherent, or in the sense that they essentially hamstring the DM in some way. So it's almost better for him to ignore it. Like, it's very hard to get to like the level of thinking about how to design these things and the experience of doing it over and over again. Because I mean, my earlier tables and things I did long ago are not as good as the tables I do now, right? Or the mechanics of those sorts of special mechanics I do now. So it's kind of a tough designer skill. You rarely see that being done well, for example, in most D&D products, and I don't just mean lately.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two general solutions to that problem that I've found. Maybe three. So two, or maybe depending on how you count it, one of those is very conventional, and one of those is very untested and very weird, and I don't even know if I like it yet. And when I tell people about it, or even when I publish it, people are going to be mad. So I'll talk about the conventional one first. The conventional one is, first off, you need multiple tables that combine into one prompt. If you have, you could have maybe you separate out the situation into 3 or 5 different parts, and you have, say, a D10 table for each part. Well, 5 D10 tables gives 10 to the 5th power possibilities. You're rarely going to get a repeat on that, because that's what, 10,000?
Exactly.
Yeah. On average, you'll get a repeat on that every 10,000 times. And then the second part of that, I think, is rather than give definite things, give prompts for the GM, like someone important in the scene gets mad over something unexpected.
Yeah, that's a very good technique in the right sort of context. Yeah.
And then the way that's going to make people mad, even just by describing it, let me call it up so I can have a example I'm reading off of. So I have one of my upcoming projects is called Psychedelic Pacific Stories, and it's about it's loosely about the Pacific Islander voyaging period. We're talking like Pacific Ocean islands, about 10th century AD. They're still being populated. Everyone's settling an island. There's lots of stuff going around. And these people actually historically were traveling the entire Pacific. They had better boats than the Europeans did at this time.
Oh, theoretically, they got to Easter Island, right? So
yeah, they did. There's actually some evidence that they had contact with South America. It's believed that that's where South America got chickens from to some extent, and that's where Pacific Islanders got sweet potatoes from, but that's sort of speculative, and the science on that isn't settled, and that might turn out not to be true, but
still interesting. It's possible. It's definitely possible.
Anyways, so they're very interesting people. I have a lot of respect for them. But I can't really expect the average person to understand Pacific Islands or really Pacific Islander culture. I have two like island building methods in it. Ideally, Brandon actually started. Ideally, you'd use the real world map of the Pacific, and every island you came to would be a fantastical version of a real world island, and you'd understand the geography and culture of the Pacific Islands well enough to do this. And I give instructions on how to fantasticalize Pacific Islands, put a mecha on it, put a dragon on it, put some aliens there, say that the locals have enslaved goblin people, whatever. Have some fun with it. It's sort of a funner game. But my general expectation is that most people who play the game will not have that knowledge. And so I make a prompt for an LLM that anyone can put into an LLM like ChatGPT. And it spits out about 20 island premises, and one of them is going to be good. And then you just ignore the other 19. And I don't know.
Those sort of tools could be very useful in the future, especially as AI gets better at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the limits of this technology are. It's possible that we'll look back on it in a couple of years the way we look back on NFTs now, and it all just seems silly to us. Maybe we'll really run up against huge limits on this, but maybe we
it's
won't.
Very hard to tell. I mean, on the one hand, you have like Elon Musk saying that in 2 years there'll be an AI that is smarter than every human on the planet. But then on the other hand, I've seen some very credible articles that say that essentially the way AI has been set up to work now, it's never going to be able to function without a human interface, right? So it's essentially a really super advanced version of autocorrect or something like that. It's something that has built-in limitations. That means that it's going to be a tool and nothing more than that. So it goes everywhere from like it'll totally change the world and maybe end the human race to it'll be like an exciting new tool. That's it.
I think it'll be an exciting new tool.
I'm closer on that end of it too. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed that they're running up against real problems with being able to mine enough data to make a better version of it. Like, there might just not be enough data in the world to make ChatGPT 5.
Could be. Yeah, that's an interesting argument there. I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, no,
that's coming outside of my area of expertise. Don't get me to comment on tech because I definitely don't know enough about that.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough.
And that sounds very interesting what you're talking about there with the Pacific Islands, and I guess you could go one of two ways, right? You can do it very historically authentic, but then, as you say, you'd have to do a whole bunch of cultural, contextual explanations about the entire culture. Because I mean, I've got multiple degrees in the humanities and history and in comparative studies, and I would know very little about how to authentically role play that culture, right? Like, whereas it's very different that, like, even in Sword and Caravan, even though it's the Middle East is a very different culture, people know enough at least kind of like contextually from the context of their own culture of the Muslim world, that all you have to do is kind of set up, you have to set up some parameters of saying, well, this is what they were like at this time, and this is what their culture is like, and you don't have to make a huge section trying to describe all the specific details, just the overall boundaries of it, because they know how to present it otherwise by cultural immersion, let's say. But you couldn't do that with the Pacific Islands. So the other alternative is just, like you say, go all out with making it fantastical, right? And that these are, and that probably ties in. I don't know now. I'm being speculative here, but that would probably tie into the myths that the Pacific Islanders themselves have of magical islands all over the place, right? Because usually those kind of cultures do have those kind of myths,
So, okay, so talking about magic in the Pacific Island context, I feel like might be too much of a European frame, because they didn't have a materialist view of the world that really clearly separated magic into non-magic.
Right. But a better term might be fantastical, right? Like that there were
100%. Yeah. And
every that like in those kind of cultures, the island that was 2 islands away, that is to say, far enough that very few people had gotten to it, that's where the guys with the dog heads live, or things like that, like, so that happened in Europe too, right? For a long period of time.
Well,
that sort of
they actually had to be way further away than that, to say that things were
how much they traveled.
But at the same time, things were way closer than that. We're like, on one island. So there's this island called Nan Madol. And Nan Madol has massive stone monuments on it. It's the sort of thing where when Europeans showed up, they're like, white people must have made this, because we can't imagine natives making it. Nope. Natives made it. The people who live there made Nan Madol. It looks like it's sunken. It's not sunken. It was intentionally built submerged so that it could be navigated by boat. It's a very interesting thing. It covers a huge portion of the island. It's honestly it's massive, and they made it by hand. It's just a temple complex, really. They themselves had huge disagreements over who built it and how they built it. They're like, foreigners built it, or we built it, or giants built it, or a wizard built it, or a serpent god and a bird god fought through their followers to compete to build it. This, that, the other thing, and they just sort of make up stories, like anyone would. If you're bored, you make up stories.
Well, that also happened in a lot of Mesoamerica, especially in like the areas around Mexico and Central America, where you had these great civilizations that then died out, but they left their monuments. And, within 100 years or so, there are stories of, these people were like gods or whatever, right? Like there was this, or they were terribly evil people who were, punished by the gods or what have you, because it's to explain something they no longer know, how it was done, Well, that sounds like the makings of a great game, actually.
It's a really fun, picaresque kind of game, yeah.
I want to get back to Lords of Ur, because Chris Miller here has a comment. He says, "So, what is Lords of Ur, and how is it similar to Angkor? Stay in your lane, Taylor." Joking. Because I don't know if you know that Chris Miller wrote an RPG called Angkor. This was before he started publishing some of my stuff. That is based on Mesopotamia, right, and Mesopotamian mythology and all of that. Though it has like this kind of sci-fi bent to it, So, can you tell us more about Lords of Ur?
So, Lords of Ur is based on the very earliest period of literate Sumerian history called the Early Dynastic period. It's a period of time when, like, the biggest city in Ur is 40,000 people and the smallest one is 5,000. And there's about 9 or so cities of note. It's a little bit, choosing 9 is like a little bit arbitrary on my part. I had to make a lot of creative decisions just because this is so early that interpretation is difficult. But I decided there's about 9 that I'm covering. There's 9 cities that at the start on the map. It's early enough that the coastline is actually different. This is the coastline of Mesopotamia shifted over time, which is because of silt buildup from all of the agriculture.
Yeah, that was a big problem for them later on, right? That the desalination level made it a crisis for them to develop enough food.
Yeah, it's why a lot of the center of Mesopotamian civilization moved northwards and westwards over time, because they just sort of farmed their land to death. As for Anchor, I don't have those kinds of sci-fi elements. It's very, I don't want to say historical because I don't have a PhD in Sumerian history, but it's as historical.
From what you were from what you were posting on Twitter, it sounded to me like it had a lot of the mythological elements in it, right? Like you.
Oh, 100%.
You connect to the Epic of Gilgamesh a few times on Twitter with what you've been posting about it.
Yeah, it's as historical as I could reasonably make it, but it's the historical Sumeria as the Sumerians understood it. So, like, not only are the gods real, but they're in the faction table.
Yeah, they're doing all kinds of crap. Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Like when you roll.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, when you roll, so the faction table works on 3 levels of sub-city factions, city factions, and gods. And when you roll that you're using the gods rules that day, you roll for which god is going to affect things, and then that god does something in their domain, like a drought or a flood or a plague or a new invention or a social movement or something, and it just totally affects some other faction's faction percentage and either ruins their day or makes their day or does whatever they want to do. So, like, the gods are present and they cause all of the sort of random phenomena in the world. Also, they're in the encounter table.
That's awesome. I want to talk more about factions later because I want to discuss those particular mechanics. But what I was going to say is that what you're doing there sounds a lot like what I did in Arrows of Indra, where Arrows of Indra is early India, but is the early India as depicted in the Mahabharata, right? Which we know is not exactly how it really was historically, right? But it's how the Indian myth presents it in the history, right? We just got a super chat from Chris Miller. He says, Taylor, good to see you on the stream again. I have to go. Can't wait to rewatch tomorrow. Lords of Ur sounds cool. And that's a $5 super chat. Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad we got to your question for Taylor before you had to go.
Thank you, Chris.
And Jacob said, how long will the RPG site be down for? Well, we've had a technical issue, and Brett, our tech mod there, is trying his best to take care of it. We think probably another day or so. All right. Sorry to everyone if you've been trying to get on the RPG site the last couple of days. It's been offline, but we're hoping to get it fixed as quickly as possible. So yeah, they're like in Arrows of Indra, like it's happening during the Mahabharata, right? So all of the great heroes of the Mahabharata are there. You can literally meet Krishna. He's wandering around there doing his stuff. And of course the timeline covers the events of the Mahabharata. And I think when you're dealing with like those kind of very ancient cultures, that's a really good way to go for a fantasy version of that cultural setting, you know. So I think that's a good choice.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
I definitely did I don't know if it was an explicit inspiration, but I definitely, of course, had read through Arrows of Endra to some extent, and probably it did influence my thinking on this at some point. I don't know. It's in a sense, it almost feels obvious to, rather than make up your own world, just go for, I'm going to open a history book and I am going to open a mythology book, and whatever I make is
that's
almost
been the
from that
secret
is
of my
almost.
success, you know. I know that for sure, you know, because when you look at mythology and like really ancient mythology, this is like especially in comparison to modern fantasy or sci-fi. And I'm not saying that there isn't any creativity in modern fantasy or sci-fi, but like the ancient stories, ancient legends, mythology, folklore, folk tales, etc., have such wildness to them, right? And there's stuff, and I know that if I was crafting a fantasy world just using my own head and not using those sources, what I make would be more boring than that stuff, you know. So it's one of the things that astounds me. I just recently did a video about like what the real kind of mythical roots of D&D are about, and you know, it's really crazy to me that people don't look at that stuff. But of course, it's not part of the kind of, it's certainly not part of the postmodern popular culture these days. So you know, a lot of people who are, whether they're DMing a game or whether they're trying to design a game, if they're being inspired by something, they're largely being inspired by like fantasy novels or TV shows or stuff, and they're missing an incredible mess of um, much more wild stuff, and yet stuff that's also like it taps into some part of our deep human consciousness, you know, because it's stuff that comes from these ancient sources and primal concepts.
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on this. Firstly, everyone inevitably copies. No one is an uninfluenced person. No one is really all that original. Everyone is getting their stuff from somewhere. Obviously there's creativity. Obviously there's
Yeah,
Sorry, what was that?
a large part of creativity is usually reinterpretation, right? But
Yeah.
you make a new spin on an old thing, and that's, I mean, like I said in my recent video, right? Like the D&D experience, the feeling of playing a D&D game. And I don't know if you saw this video, but I was commenting
I
that
did.
my play testers for Baptism of Fire felt that surprisingly to them, Baptism of Fire feels more like a D&D campaign than if they're playing a Dark Albion campaign or a Sword and Caravan campaign. And I think the reason for that is to do with sort of the Dark Ages context, like, you know, or very early Middle Ages context of Baptism of Fire, is actually more akin to what the underlying D&D experience is, because the D&D experience visually it's high Middle Ages or late Middle Ages even, because I mean they got arquebuses and everything, you know, but the experience of play of going into the dark dungeon to kill the monster is Beowulf, right? It's going right back to that, you know, and it's very much a kind of Dark Ages mythology of the Western variety, you know.
So I actually got into a Twitter argument with people about this. So clearly, this is going to also cause a comment argument. But I'm pretty sure that the Beowulf descends into darkness to slay the dragon is a descendant of the Proto-Indo-European legend of the hero slays the serpent. And
yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And then people on Twitter were like, no, it's not Proto-Indo-European. There's here's a Japanese variation. Here's an Indian variation. I was like, okay, first
Well, yeah,
off,
I mean,
Indians are
sure. Yeah,
yeah.
Indians are Proto-Indo-European. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then
That's where you get Aryan from,
yeah. And then
Jeez.
the Japanese one is I looked on the Wikipedia page and there was a note on the Wikipedia page. This probably comes from Hindu mythology, which they had contact with because people did travel around.
Yeah, but I mean, all of it goes back even further, right? Like to the kind of earliest, probably the earliest human myths were the hunter that goes out to kill the great bear or whatever, right? Like
Oh,
the
totally.
big monster thing that wants to eat you, right? So like this is Jordan Peterson would say that this is like it's very early evolutionary psychology, right? That was ingrained in us, along with other stuff, like the monsters of the dark and things like that. So yeah, you could go further back, right? But I mean, in the context of the Western canon, um, that's I think that the part that is being tapped into directly, let's say, through all of the later story, all the other stories that come after in the Western canon that descend from that source. Of course, Beowulf also descends from much earlier sources.
I'm now imagining a caveman excitedly be trying to like impress all of the other cavemen in his tribe around the fire, being like, "I killed a bear," and of course that's impressive. And then over time, it becomes the bear was giant, and the bear had two
Exactly.
heads. And it was deep in a cave, and I had to scare it back with my torch. And then his grandson tells the story, and the torch is magic, and the spear is magic, and there's maybe he adds some more characters, companion for his grandfather, and maybe some woman who sends him on the quest, and
you see variations of this in all the other kind of European cultures, which is why, for example, in Baptism of Fire, it mentions that the kind of the Polish version of this story, which is Krakus having gone under Wawel Hill and killed the dragon Smok, right, to liberate that region from his tyranny, and then he established the city of Krakow. So it's that's the Proto-Indo-European hero myth, all redone Polish style. Right up to like the fact that then later he goes out into the wilderness and he takes the great rod that he used to kill the dragon and plants it on the ground, and it turns into this enormous stone pillar, that people still identify as Krakus's rod. Like it's got the whole deal. Like you listen to that, and it's a Polish legend, but it's also like all the same elements of it are found in much earlier mythologies. Okay, let's look at some other questions from the chat, because otherwise we can get too far behind on that. Matthew Sinan says, what's the best start to research medieval magic? That's a tough one. There are a lot of books on medieval magic. Like I hate these kinds of questions, actually, because like what you could do in theory is get a history degree and then look at the actual sources of the medieval grimoires, right? But that's pretty tough. But nowadays, lately, in like the last few years, and I don't offhand, I can't remember the titles of any of them, but there's a number of books that have been written, because in modern occultism, there's this kind of subculture that have gotten very into trying to like look again and sort of recreate the magic of the grimoire tradition, right? But look at those actual grimoires first, and that's like, and some of these books help you do that, right? Like they give contextual explanations of these texts, where they came from and what they're meant to be about. So that's one way to do it. I don't know how much else I can say about that. I don't know if you've got any insights on that, Taylor.
I do, but I have a feeling like we're going to get into an obscure argument about like Renaissance magical traditions, and you're going to outflank me because you know more about that. But well, I'll try my best. So the systemization of magic into things like grimoires is kind of more of a thing of like the Renaissance and early modern period than it was of the true medieval period. The true medieval period in magic in the true medieval period was like either something that maybe your grandmother knew some sort of chant or something, and she wouldn't have even really thought of it as like magic, because magic is something that bad foreign people do. It's like, oh, this is just a tradition I have, and that this is how you can cure a fever. Or
what you're
it'd be
talking about is
something.
the tradition of folk magic, right? Which was
Yeah.
Which is something that almost every culture has, and that was like
Yes.
the magic of the common people. And
But
that's true. That all of that exists, and it goes down. Sometimes the roots of those folk magic spells go back very far. But yeah, there's because there are two currents of it, right? There's the folk magic, which, by the way, I have folk magic in Baptism of Fire, because the pagans in Poland at that time, and a lot of the Christians, a lot of people who were Christians, continued to practice those magical practices of folk magic. And then the other side of it, what's called the Hermetic tradition. And it's true that it systematized much more in a much more complex way in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
But like, the earliest grimoires are what you would usually call like the High Middle Ages, though I guess it varies, because like, in Italy, the 1370s was already kind of the Renaissance, so it depends on when you say the Renaissance started.
So there's a third aspect to it, which is much more controversial to talk about, and I again think you're going to outflank me here, which is to say the sort of hybrid folk magic, systematized magic that a lot of village priests would have been doing. Because there was a consistent thing, especially in the late Middle Ages, of priests doing things that maybe their superiors pretty consistently saw as heretical or unauthorized, but the priests themselves saw as necessary to keep things going. Where it tended to be magic very much within the Christian tradition, but I don't know. This is just something I've heard about.
I would almost categorize that as folk religion, and in like third world countries, you still see that today, right? Where the priest is called on to like pray away evil spirits from the house or things like that,
Yes, absolutely.
Which is seen as not really proper by the like intellectual elements of the church, right? And there was some of that for sure. Of course, monks in the Middle Ages were the original Hermetic magicians of the Middle Ages, right? Like that's the monastic tradition is that, what was his name? Albertus Magnus, and what was his name? Thomas Aquinas was a disciple of Albertus Magnus as a magician, and he later kind of tried to say that he wasn't really into that, but at the time, he helped Magnus create his brazen head and everything else, and then he accidentally broke it, and that ended their relationship. But there are different branches of what you could call medieval magic, right? Of course, by my own bias, I tend to focus more on the high magic, as they would sometimes call it, as opposed to the folk magic. But folk magic can be really interesting too, and that's why I include it in Baptism of Fire. And I also have it it's also in the Invisible College, because in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, folk magic has been doing a bit of a comeback tour. All right, other questions. Isaac Mark says, how related to medieval Russia is Poland at this time? If you mean at the time of Baptism of Fire, there is no place called medieval Russia. There is the Kiev Rus, right, which are, I don't know if you saw the recent interview with Tucker Carlson, but when Putin starts talking about Yaroslav the Wise and all that, well, he's talking about the Kiev Rus, right, which he tries to claim are like the true origin of the Russian people. And he's not completely wrong, actually. So the Kiev Rus were the neighbors of the Poles, and they were sometimes allies and sometimes enemies. And there's quite a lot of material about them in Baptism of Fire. Let me see what else we've got. Okay, so Joshman has a question, which I think was probably related to you to when we were talking about like the distribution of players and their engagement. He says, here's a question. What do you do as a player if you are one of those who likes to do stuff, but the rest of the players just sit there in silence or can't come up with any decisions? That's a tough question for me because I'm hardly ever a player. I don't know if Taylor has anything to say about this.
Oh, I have an answer, but it's not going to be popular.
Okay. I wonder if it's similar to what I'd say. Go ahead.
What you do if you're the only player at the table who wants to do things and everyone else just wants to sit there, there's really two options, and you're going to be a dick in both of them. First off, you just start giving the other players orders, which they're either going to hate or they're going to be kind of relieved because they want to know what to do when you're telling them what to do. So sometimes people just want to participate and don't know how. But you can't just be a dick in this situation. That's a strong possibility. Or you can just sort of go off on your own and do the thing you want to do. And if they come along for the ride, they come along for the ride. And if they don't, that's sort of their problem.
Yeah, and which of those two you should do kind of depends on what the campaign is like, right? Because if you've got a campaign where the DM is kind of expecting that everybody works together as a party all the time, then doing the second thing will make you very unpopular with the DM, as well as maybe the other players. Whereas if it's the kind of campaign where player characters can be expected to do their own things, then you go and you do your own thing. But kind of the question to me is a bit of a trap because every player who likes to do a lot of stuff thinks that they're contributing to the campaign by doing that. But sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes you've got a group where there's a ton of people that are really passive and they're very happy to let you take the lead as the player that actually wants to move forward with stuff, right? But at other times, it's also the case that if you have a player that always wants to be involved in whatever is going on, that because of that personality, it sucks out the air from the room for the other players to, who are maybe just a little less extroverted to start doing their own things too. So one of the things that I think is potentially a responsibility for a player who is that way, who's a very proactive player, is to get a chance to not just jump in and take the lead, but also to try to see if he can't coax some ideas from some of the other players and kind of encourage them, especially if there's a difference in like level of experience as a gamer, to encourage them to make suggestions and try things, but that requires a pretty mature player.
Yeah.
All right. Isaac Mark says, what's the guest name again? I'm talking with Taylor Lane here, who is a game designer. Most of your stuff is on itch.io, I believe. Is that right? Or are you now branching off into different places?
I'm on itch.io. I'm on DriveThruRPG. I've had requests from people to go on to Lula, because apparently Lula does print on demand, and people want...
Lulu, right?
What?
Lulu, right?
Do I?
Lula is the president of Brazil. Lulu is the small press independent publishing thing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I probably mean Lulu, and probably not the president of Brazil.
Yeah, the Dark Albion is published on Lulu as well as DriveThru, and they make one of the things they do is that they have very high quality publishing. Though I think often the price and also the price of shipping is sometimes higher than DriveThrus, but some people really like it, and especially if they don't want to buy from DriveThru.
Yeah, I don't fully understand people's desire for physical books. although I fully understand that I am in the extreme minority in my opinions on this. If
I love
people
physical
would go along, what? Sorry, what?
I love physical books.
Yeah, if people would go along with it with me, I would not even publish my games as PDFs. I'd publish them as full screen HTML files that were infinitely scrolling and had no pages.
My God.
But no one other than me wants to read RPG books that way, and so I just suck it up and I make the PDF.
Well, there could be something said to doing an HTML rule book that had convenient connected hyperlinks, right? So instead of having to like scroll all the way down or up, when you were looking at something, and you'd have like a list of tags of related links to like the other parts of the rules that you might need to look at in the context of the thing you're looking up at the moment, you know?
So you can actually do that in a PDF.
That would be convenient. Yeah, you can. Well, that's true. You can do that with PDFs too, but yeah, it's interesting. So I want to take this moment to comment on one of the reasons why I wanted to have Taylor here as a guest. Partly because Taylor's got some stuff as we've been seeing that is new and available, and it's good for you guys to get the opportunity to hear about this, because Taylor's products are on the more unorthodox side of the OSR, and they're very creative and very interesting. But mainly it's that you know, following Taylor on Twitter, almost everything that Taylor posts is stuff that gets me thinking about RPGs and about RPG design, you know. And on Twitter, I've got a lot of followers and a lot of people I follow, but there's actually only 3 accounts that I have alerts for notification whenever the person posts, right? Like the little bell notification or whatever it is. One of them is Elon Musk, just because Elon, he makes this endless series. Every night he ends up doing a series of posts where he's mostly just responding like wow or OMG or whatever to some other post that someone has done that's usually something to do with, you know, the battle with woke culture, or it's about his Tesla stuff, which I'm not that interested in. But you know, you see a lot of interesting stuff from Elon Musk, right? A second one is a friend of mine who is not in any way related to the RPG hobby, but who is a very intelligent guy, and he's mostly involved in the finance world. And he hardly ever posts anything himself, but he retweets articles and things like that. And it's usually articles that I don't end up seeing on Twitter, because we've got very different algorithms going on. And so it provides me with some interesting stuff I would have missed. And then the third person is Taylor, right? So that's the only person involved in RPGs that I have got an alert for every time they post a tweet. And it's because inevitably a large percentage of Taylor's tweets get me thinking a lot about RPGs and RPG designs and RPG ideas, you know. So I think that is itself a very good reason to have you on, Taylor, and to try to alert other people to the fact that if one of the things that interests you in the audience is about like the conceptual ideas in RPGs, RPG design, RPG mechanics, settings, all kinds of stuff, then it's well worth following that, you know, following Taylor's account on Twitter, because it always, at least for me, it always gets me thinking about stuff.
Wow, first off, I had no idea that you had a notification for my account set up. I'm very flattered. Second off, that explains a lot of your Twitter behavior over the years, where I'll be like, Pundit responded to all of the tweets that I made in the past 48 hours at the same time. Yeah. That's weird.
Exactly, because I look it up on my notifications thing, right? It always shows up.
Yeah, all right. That's
Yeah,
probably
no,
also why.
there's nobody else in gaming that gets me that gets my mind working on like different ideas. And I have to say, some of it has been directly inspiring to stuff I've then done. Right, like there's a couple of things I can't think of it offhand, but a couple of things that ended up in issues of Pundit Presents or the Pundit Files that had at least some original inspiration from stuff that you'd written. And in Baptism of Fire, the new domain rules and rules for mass combat that I'm putting in has had a lot to do with stuff that you'd written about how you should really handle domain mechanics in a medieval context where because we generally do that. And I mean, like, for example, in Lion and Dragon I have that, and it's reprinted in the Old School Companion 1, a set of domain management and mass combat mechanics that are based on kind of these values of different resources that the person in question manages in different ways, right? But you made the point, and it's a very good point, that in the medieval period, and I would argue specifically in the early medieval period above all, it really wasn't like that, right? A large part of it depended on two major factors, which is how happy your peasants were and how loyal your henchmen were, you know. And I said, yeah, okay, that like put on a light bulb in my head about that, right? Because it's absolutely true, and that's especially for the early medieval context as opposed to late medieval context, a much better way to handle that kind of mechanic. So that's what I have in Baptism of Fire, is a mechanic that's based on that idea.
Okay, well now I'm really excited for Baptism of Fire. I was already trying to figure out a way to get it to my table when it comes out. I think I have someone who wants to run it already. One of my usual GMs wants to run it. So it sounds like the sort of thing I wanted to be a player in. But yeah, well, that's really flattering. So a few things that I want to note about medieval domain management. And I actually have this supplement that I'm sort of waiting for a point in my release schedule to sort of put something out there that's sort of just me writing up a like actually to a large degree scientifically accurate model of how a medieval business works.
Huh. Good luck with that. Because I think most historians of economics haven't figured that out yet.
I'll send you the Google Docs file. It's about 6 pages. You'll look at it. You'll go, oh, huh, I guess that would work, but it's a little bit awkward. And, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But up until the 1800s, even small businesses generally didn't know whether they were making a profit or a loss until
exactly.
Sometimes ever. Usually they'd have some sort of point where where it become really obvious that they were either in bankruptcy or doing really well. But the idea of having detailed accountancy is not really something historical. So yeah, if you're talking about like,
I think like proper accountancy starts in the 16th century with that the German banker, I forget his name now. The guy was at that time, in his own time, he was the richest man in the world, right? Like he was.
You might be talking about someone named Fugger, but I'm kind of guessing.
Right, yeah, I think that's it. Yeah,
that name just sounds slightly right to me.
One big part of that was like double entry accounting, right? Which is invention that happened right around that time.
Yeah,
but you're right. But before that, and you know, even after that, because most people didn't do it, right? There was it was very hard to know if you were ever making money or not, and to simulate that in a game is kind of interesting, right?
Yes. So for a medieval lord running a much bigger operation with much less administrators and per unit resource, and so on and so forth, to even know how many resources they're deploying at any given time, or even what they control, is ridiculous. The entire point of feudalism as a strategy, and the reason it got reinvented over and over again in Europe, in India, in Japan, is if you don't have enough administrators for the territory that you theoretically control, you can either sit on that territory and do literally nothing with it, or you can part it out to whatever bandits are going to pop up in the territory anyways, or someone that you replace those bandits with, and say, okay, you control this area now. Figure out how to make it produce something for me, like troops. And they will then inevitably have to part out their area. And do the same thing. And eventually you get down to something that a human being can kind of process, which is there are these 1 to 5 villages. And I know that if I scare the headman enough and or convince the headman that I'm valuable enough to him, he's going to get me the 30 bushels of wheat that I know that his village can probably produce this year. But you're probably going to be undertaxing or overtaxing these people. You don't have cadastral surveys of them. You don't have you have no idea of how to tax them really at any detailed level. There's this
what that does in game design is that it makes a random element, something that's very out of the control of the player, make a lot of sense, right? Like part of what I do in these domain rules involves that there's these statistics for peasant happiness and for retainer loyalty that they're in the player character doing things influences whether or not a check happens, right? But a check can just as easily end up causing happiness to decline when you want it to go up, or loyalty to decline when you want it to go up, if you're not lucky, so that unpredictability is actually a realistic facet of what it would have been like to have to manage a territory like that in that time.
Right. And I'm assuming that you have some sort of way to interpret the check where the GM can say, actually, it turns out that there was I don't know, something in this village that you didn't check for, and because you were over here, and that's why they're pissed at you, or is it just like
one of the things I emphasize in the system in numerous contexts is that if the player character is physically present, then that changes the way that the thing works, right? Like retainers have to behave themselves, and the peasants are less likely to revolt and things like that. But if he's fucked off to go on adventure, then it becomes a lot more unpredictable,
Yeah, I remember trying to explain this concept to a man I tried to work with quite some time ago. I don't even know if I want to say his name because he's just sort of rude and irrelevant. I'm not going to say his name. I'm gonna take the high road on this. But I tried to explain to him, no one in the history of the world has ever controlled land. And this didn't make any sense to him because I kept trying to explain to him, no, we need to work with NPC loyalty, not with do you control this hex or not, because no one controls a hex. Land does not bow to you. It does not swear fealty to you. A person swears fealty to you, and you have to hope that they can manage the land.
Yeah.
What?
It's the social network that matters. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a very good point.
He didn't get it. The concept was sort of like a riddle to him. And I kept trying to explain that I wasn't like saying some sort of Zen cone to him, that it was a very straightforward thing, but he was very trapped in a sort of modern Westphalian concept of the state.
Yeah, but I mean that only functions when you have a certain advanced level of society that allows the creation of that kind of a state, right? And if you don't have that, you're not. And even then, it's mostly an illusion, right? Like it depends on people believing that the social contract is a real thing,
Yeah. Uh, I remember my mom once saying to me that if I ever got into serious trouble, to just go into the mountains.
Okay.
Kind of a sketchy lady. Love her to bits. Great woman, but she was just like, just go to the mountains if you ever think you're in real trouble. Just go into the mountains; they'll never find you.
So I want to do some more comments here from the live chat. Steambub just said, I recently picked up Dark Albion's Lulu alternative cover. That's right, because I have, most people will know what my regular cover of Dark Albion is like, but on Lulu, you can get the regular cover, but there's also one with an alternate cover that you can only get on Lulu. And Steambub also picked up Fantastic Heroes and Witchery from there. So yeah, Lulu is good in its own way. It doesn't have the same level of browsing traffic that you get in drive-through, but if someone's looking for your product already and you have it on Lulu, some people will prefer that as a choice.
Yeah.
Chris Miller, before he left, said, I play tested a lot of White Wolf stuff because I live in Atlanta. Those games overlooked a lot.
Gotcha.
They sold well because vampires were popular at the time. Yeah, that was pretty much the whole secret of White Wolf's success, is that they got it just at the right moment in time, when vampires were cool. Space Roadie says, we have evidence of dice games for over 4,000 years. When someone thinks their mechanic idea is original, it's pretty cute. That's true in a sense, right? But it's also kind of interesting that there are certain things that were done with dice or dice-like items. Like, for example, dominoes are basically a sort of a dice-like gaming item that go back absolutely to the earliest point of antiquity, right? Like the game that we know as backgammon today started as a game in like Mesopotamia or Egypt. We don't know which, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that nobody thought of doing with dice until relatively recently, right? Similarly, like there's no reason why the RPG couldn't have been invented in ancient Rome, but it wasn't, like it wasn't invented until you got to Wisconsin in the 70s, Let's see what else people have to say here. I'm way behind on the chat, but that usually happens in these live streams.
Sorry, Pundit, your internet was one of our internets was crapping out. I don't know. Kind of a crapshoot as to whether
that's happened from time to time, but yeah, I was just saying that in the chat, there's a lot of people talking about when we were talking about AI. That shows you how far back I am right now.
Yeah. Did they say anything intelligent, or was it just the same stuff as always?
It's commentary on what we both said. Some of them are in agreement that AI is not going to be particularly useful, but other people think differently. Isaac Mark said it's better to make a fantastical insert historical period world or a world like Dark Albion that is a period world with certain punctual changes than doing, I guess, another fantasy game is what he meant to say. Well, I think that there's a market for that. I mean, that's been a big part of my success, but part of it demands, though, that the person doing it has to really know the source material, because it's it's not just me, right? There have been other people who have done this, and those games usually get people's attention, right? Whether it's Kin or Aquilare, which was before anything I ever did, or other stuff. Makwaidal by the Basic Expert, he's obviously researched that topic a lot, and I know the Basic Expert doesn't like me very much, but his game certainly looks like a very good historical authentic game, and I'm not afraid to say that. There's a market for that, but it means you have to put in the research, to make it really worthwhile. Otherwise, you're just doing something that's kind of like, it's D&D, but with a Polynesian flavor or whatever.
Something that I noticed with all of the previous attempts at like a historical Mesopotamian game is, first off, Almost all of them are Babylonian for some reason.
There are quite a few of those, yeah.
I don't know why, but it's all Babylonian. Or it's just not historical at all. Like there's a lot of stuff that's like that's like Mesopotamian flavor, but not like a specific Mesopotamian period. There's like Into the Bronze, Blood and Bronze, Bloody Handed Name of Bronze, lot of stuff with bronze in the title. Arguably even RuneQuest is like that, although I don't want to lump it into the same category as those because it's a bit more well thought out. And I like the world, although part of what made me even make Lords of Ur was the dissatisfaction with my usual GM, one of my usual GMs of with RuneQuest. They didn't like the number of stats that the system had and stuff. I didn't fully understand the critique. RuneQuest seems fine to me, but I decided, fuck it, I'll just make one myself. Can't be that hard, and it wasn't. I don't know. Anyways, my main point here is that it didn't actually take that much research to make Lords of Ur. Like, yes, I read, I think, what was it? A history book, and then I watched a bunch of documentaries, and I read a bunch of Wikipedia pages, and I read some other stuff. But frankly, I was probably going to do that anyways because I love history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say, because a lot of people that are like academics really crap all over Wikipedia, but when Wikipedia is terrible for almost anything contemporary because there's a lot of political biases in it. But in terms of like most historical or cultural articles on Wikipedia nowadays, they've got a lot of very good citation. They've got a lot of very good data. They're very careful about accuracy, and so they're if you're not, let's say, a professional historian, but you want to do a campaign that gets into like real historical details or mythology details or things like that. Wikipedia is not a bad place to look, right? Like it's a very accessible way to get a historical education on a particular place and time.
Yeah, and sort of the counterpoint to that of like you do need to do some research is it's not like making stuff up that's satisfying is any easier than just doing your own research and translating that over to something. I spent 2 years trying to do a very detailed hex crawl of a fantastical map based on a map of the state of Oregon. And no one's ever seen that project, and no one's ever going to see that project because eventually I just gave the fuck up. And I essentially just wasted 2 years of my own time. Whereas it took me, what, a month or so to make Lords of Ur?
That's pretty fast.
I still got to play test it and finish layout, but
yeah,
in terms of
but
something playable, yeah.
Yeah. So Isaac Marks has a question, which I think is a good one to bring up here to you, actually. But what do you all think of Kevin Crawford's stuff? And he specifies, especially Worlds Without Number for D&D Fantasy. But I think I'd like to ask about that in general, because I know that you're very into faction mechanics, and in my experience, a lot of attempts at doing faction mechanics in RPGs are very, very clunky at best. Either they're too vague, or they're not, or they're too involved and complicated and stuff. And I think that out of the stuff that I've seen, Kevin Crawford is the closest to what seems to be useful, certainly in the OSR, but probably in general. Though I have to say that even there, I don't it's something that is just not quite my style. But what do you think about Kevin Crawford and the stuff that he's done with factional play in a lot of his products?
So I'm going to have to qualify a number of the statements I'm going to make so that I'm not quoted out of context here, because there has to be nuance. So first off, I guess point one of three, I guess. I have played a lot of Worlds Without Number, and one abortive game of incredibly house-ruled Stars Without Number. We were playing what I can only describe as capitalist Star Trek.
Okay.
We thought it would be funny if instead of if we were like playing the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, whose job it was to go out to the stars, meet new cultures, and make trade agreements with them. So we house rule in things like you get XP for trying to stop other people from violating the non-aggression principle. And
all right.
Most of the fun there was just that all of our characters got to argue at in depth. I think you actually also got XP for arguing about what the non-aggression principle meant. And anyways, the GM gave up on it because of a spate of depression that he was unfortunately going through, that he felt made him unable to really run the game. But that being neither here nor there, I think that his Without Number games are very fun. I do not actually like the faction system. However, because it's so prevalent, it's what I have to recommend to people as this is what a faction system looks like. But while I am very in favor of simulationism in some sense of like everything the mechanics, simulationism to me means everything in the mechanics corresponds to something in the world. And if you just come with a coherent theory of the world, you will be able to understand what you're doing mechanically. So like every decision the player makes should correspond to a decision the PC is making. I should never have to ask, okay, but what does your character's cool stat actually mean? It should be really clear what it means. And I do try and strive for that. However, you don't actually need to simulate in detail multiple stats for every faction. And if you try and do that, you are increasing the amount of time that it takes to run each faction. And if you're trying to run 30 factions at once, you can't afford to increase the time per faction by even 1 minute. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to run 30 or even 50 factions at once, which you could very well be doing for an especially madcap kind of game, you need to choose the most minimal faction system possible. And the most minimal faction system possible is one with either 0 stats or no stats, or 1 stat per faction. I don't think you can really make a 0 stat per faction system work, although I'd be interested to hear it out. So what I do, at least for my heavily house-ruled Unknown Armies game that we've been playing at various Unknown Armies games for years, and at this point, we don't even really refer to the original rules. We just have our binder of what we've updated the rules to. But we have a faction system for it, and the faction system is just every faction has a goal and a percentage that they're towards that goal. Roll D100. If you get under their percentage, they did something off screen that the PCs notice that advances them towards completing their goal, and increase their goal percentage by the sum of the ones place and the tens place of the die. That's it. All you need is something that reminds the GM, hey, this faction exists, it wants a thing, and it probably did something off screen. Tell the players what that thing is. They're one step closer to accomplishing their goal. If the players don't interfere with this and stop them, they'll get what they want.
That's very interesting, because that I agree with you about that in the context of Crawford's faction system. And the closest thing I've ever done to having a faction mechanic is in the Invisible College, where in the appendix of the Invisible College, because part of the background of the game, of the setting, is that you have these secret occult groups that are they're fighting a secret war basically for the future of human evolution. And as part of that war, they're infiltrating all kinds of different elements of society, right? So they're influencing governments, they're influencing corporations, they're influencing institutions and things like that. And so there's a mechanic in the appendix of one of the appendices of the game that allows you to generate levels of control for any particular kind of organization that these different groups will have, right? And to determine if they have any influence over a specific institution and what level of influence they have. And sometimes some institutions are completely controlled only by a single occult group, and in some cases there are there are some that are majority controlled by one group, but that another group or other groups have infiltrated to some degree. And so this can represent the level of conflict over that particular resource in the campaign. If you're running a campaign of Invisible College that gets to those kind of higher level concepts of how much they're, how much these groups are controlling different parts of the world, and so there it's basically I do it kind of the opposite way around, that instead of giving a percentage of level of power or influence of the group, I say, well, what's their level of influence on specific areas of society, that you can then look at that group and say, okay, well, the Boy Scouts are 37% controlled by the Invisible College, and 28% controlled by the Black Lodge, or something like that.
That's really interesting, because I'd been thinking about making a similar system to that for a cyberpunk system that I don't think I'll ever really find a satisfying way to make into something publishable. So I'm just going to go read your system and probably rip it off wildly. I'll put it in the, if I actually publish this, I'll put a shout out in the credits if I do that. But yeah, because
everybody's ripping everybody off in the OSR. So
yeah, but if you
idea, you bring it in.
Yeah, but I like to try, if I can remember what my influences are, I like to mention them as much as a polite thing, as a boast thing of, hey, look how cool I am, look at how many games I'm reading, look how, et cetera, et cetera. Because I feel like people have this norm on IP in their head of like everyone's supposed to pretend that they're this sui generis person that is influenced by no one and didn't copy anyone, and there's something shameful about doing your own version of something great. And there's not something shameful about doing your own version of something great. If you're just sort of taking someone else's thing and changing all the verbs with a thesaurus, yeah, you suck, and that's basically theft, and etc.
One thing to do, like Roses on Her Grave style cut and paste plagiarism, right? And then there's getting inspiration from sources, and I've never been shy to say that, for example, Lion and Dragon started out sort of similar to what happens, what your system for Unknown Armies is like, that Lion and Dragon started, like the Dark Albion campaign started as a Lamentations of the Flame Princess campaign, and then as we went along, we realized that there was stuff in the Lamentation system that didn't really fit the medieval authentic concept, and so we started house ruling it until it became a completely different game. But it was a game that started as Lamentations, and then turned into what looks like Lion and Dragon today, and there's lots of stuff that I've been influenced by, either directly or inspiration of people who I've thought of as great game designers, like Eric Wujcik and stuff like that. So But yeah, I'm constantly looking at other stuff and seeing, well, oh, can I do something like that here, right? And in my Gonzo campaign, the World of the Last Sun, there are multiple parts of the World of the Last Sun that are like, this is my version of somebody else's thing, you know, like the Venture Satanis made Alpha Blue, and it's like a weird space station, and I decided to have Fuck Station Aleph in, in World of the Last Sun, which is basically my ripoff of his. That is that I think is a better product than his, you know. And I did the same thing with like an area called the Shithole that is kind of an homage to Dark Sun, and also my my what is it, like hatagram to Carcosa, which I thought was an interesting concept that was terribly badly executed, you know. So
What did
yeah,
you, what
I
did you
do
not
that
like
sort of
about
thing all the
Carcosa?
time. Well, Carcosa, it struck me as being um, like it's got a lot of the worst qualities of badly made sandboxes, you know. Like, first of all, it's got way too much of the kind of look at, you know, taking itself too seriously as this like dark metal, everything is sinister, and you have to do like these rituals where you know, murder prepubescent children to summon dark gods that will then eat you for no reason, you know. Like it's and like there's stuff in it that you look at it and you go, this could be great, you know, but it's actually, in actual play, it's probably kind of a bore once you get over how, you know, feeling edgy about playing it, you know. Like, it's so, you know, with the Shithole, I took some of the same concepts and made it into something that is that has a lot more playability, I think, you know. So it's yeah, I thought it was just a product that was way too full of itself, whereas, you know, the Shithole is very intentionally comedic in many respects, you know.
Yeah.
um, it's the same thing I hate about the Drow, for example, right? In World of the Last Sun, I have the Shadow Elves, which are like, you know, they're like the Drow. They're dark skinned elves that have you know, they always have ridiculously heavy metal type armor with spikes coming out of it and long hair, and they all look dark and sinister. And then I make a big point of emphasizing that every single one of them speaks in these high pitched squeaky voices like this, so nobody takes them seriously, you know. And there's a lot of the Last Sun stuff is me shitting on other people's work, actually. But at the same time, making it a better product, I think, than the original, you know, by basically making fun of people who are just a little bit too proud of themselves and what they did, you know.
Yeah.
Anyways, what else have we got here?
The chat thinks that my capitalist Star Trek game was bad. Yeah, well, we dropped in the
Really,
middle,
because
so maybe.
I would think that if humans go out into the stars and find other civilizations, one of the biggest things they'd be doing is trading with them, you know. So I guess it can depend on how you run it, right? Because you could run a really serious version of that, or you could run one where, you know, the humans are basically Ferengi or something, which then would be kind of stupid.
100%. We're basically Ferengi was something we said during the planning session. It was 100%. Humans are basically Ferengi. I think at one point my character gave a long speech to the assembled crew of his capital ship of talking about how I may have to sacrifice all of your lives, but the line will go up, referring to the stock
Right,
price of the company.
like a parody campaign in a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's always been a serious way to do this, which is like Traveler, right? Like, Traveler is basically that. You're a space trader for the most part.
Yeah.
So
I would
let me
compare
see
it
what
more
else.
to Space Dutch East India Company.
Yeah, well, that's another way to do it, right? It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
we saw that in real history, you know. So
Yeah.
Making that a part of it can be very interesting, actually.
We had rules for how our characters would be replaced if
Capitalism.
we didn't increase the stock price enough. Yeah, I don't know. They're at least two of them don't think that my Unknown Armies faction system sounds very cool.
I see this. Yeah, Martin Bowman says that faction system sounds insanely boring. I think the players play in the first person, and anything outside of that experience is really relevant. Well, Martin Bowman has a kind of a point in that, but the thing is that faction systems are not really good if the players have to think about that, right? Like unless they're running a faction, which I guess is another way of doing it. But generally, a good faction system should be there for the same reason that you have like random generators in the game and things like that, is to give the DM cues to work out of, right? So it should be a DM tool that the players never have to, like, again, unless they're running a faction, they never have to engage with themselves. They only see the effects of it in terms of events that happen in the game because of faction activities, you know? And there it can be like a relevant, like, I mean, imagine you're doing a sandbox, right? And you have like the warlord of the north, and you have the merchant princes in the east, and then, you know, in the south, you have the old kingdom or whatever, right? And so you want to figure out like, well, what are those different groups' interests, and what will that cause them to do in the run of the campaign? Sometimes it might be in reaction to stuff the player characters do, and other times it'll be that it's stuff that they're doing that then end up affecting the players, right? Now, I think one of the reasons why I haven't done a lot of faction systems is because all of my medieval authentic games have a real life chronology of things that happened, right? Like, so in Sword and Caravan, you get the timetable that goes from like 1192 all the way up to like about 1222. And what that means is I don't have to like roll to see what these different groups are doing. I can just look at what they did in history. And so if player characters are in a certain place at a certain time, in my current Sword and Caravan campaign, the player characters are in the area of the Seljuk Turks. And at that moment, there's a civil war going on among the Seljuk Turks. And the Khwarezmians, which are the empire next door, takes advantage of that to occupy the city of Ray, which is the border city between the two of them, right? And so in the campaign, they weren't there at the time, but they had left there one of their main NPC allies, and also certain resources that they had. And so those were now behind enemy lines, and the player characters had to deal with that, right? And so it's an event that, you know, in other games that would be a kind of a random event, but if you're using faction play, it could be that you're, as the DM, instead of you thinking it up as if you were the author and saying, well, okay, now these guys are going to do this and that, you know, instead you have like a mechanic that you can choose to apply instead to create that element of the living world, right? Where there's, instead of saying, well, you know, now in my great plot line that I have in my head, this is going to happen, you're saying, well, this might happen, so let's roll to see, you know, based on what this faction's interest is or whatever, let's roll to see whether they decide to try to take this city or not, you know. And so then once that happens, it changes the campaign. It's to determine events in the campaign. It's like a random event table more than anything, or a random event mechanic anyway. It's not usually a table.
So coincidentally, and you might know that the very tweet that I'm about to bring up, I tweeted out, hey, did anyone ever make a butterflies table? At one point of obviously, if you're gonna, I think that this idea of having a pre-made list of faction moves based off of actual history, that's great. I've never done it because it would take so much work, but I love that you have. I love that you did the thing that. I love that you weren't a lazy asshole that actually did the thing. But
yeah, well,
let's hypothesize that the players are playing at a level where they genuinely could influence things that the Khwarezmian, is that how you pronounce it? I've only ever seen it written.
Khwarezmian
Empire is going to do. Let's say that you really are that powerful. then obviously what you need for each of these events is the GM should look at it, and if they go, well, I don't know if they'd still do that because the players did X, there should be some sort of butterflies table for them to roll on of what do they do, how is the event different because of the players' actions, and it could have a list of prompts of X is different based off of Y or whatever. I don't know how it would work entirely, but you'd want a list of random prompts, and maybe it would be so I've been experimenting with a dice mechanic that allows for a table of, it allows for two things. First off, it allows for a table where each event on the table is less likely than the one before it. It allows for the table to be of infinite length, or arbitrary length, rather. So what you would do is you'd say roll 1d4 if you get anything, or 1d6 whatever, if you get any number other than 1, add another die and keep rolling. That's how the mechanic works. Maybe it would work something like that. So I'm trying to think of like what's like a generic sort of butterfly event. Like the event is the same, but the leader is different because of the PCs, or the leader is the same, but their approach to the event is different because of the PCs, or maybe their approach is the same, but their target is different because of the PCs. I'm spitballing off the top of my head. These are bad ideas, but you sort of get the neighborhood of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that could possibly, just thinking off the top of my head, that one way I might do that is that is like a lot of times, again, it becomes a personal thing, right? Of the people that the player characters end up influencing or pissing off or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I might regulate that with a reaction roll, of seeing whether they're motivated into action, and then you would have to maybe do some kind of a table about like what is the nature of their action, right? Are they cautious or are they reckless about it, or what happens, and that would depend possibly on the personality traits of the person involved. I didn't do this in my Lion and Dragon game, but in the same period in the same campaign right now, part of the thing that's happening is that the player characters were participants in rescuing the Sultan Toghrul of the Seljuks, who was imprisoned by his vizier. That this happened right after that vizier was poisoned to death by his own wife, right? Who had also poisoned to death her previous husband, who was the brother of the previous vizier, right? She was a really incredible historical figure named Anak Khatun, who was just this mastermind and super villainous, and she was basically plotting for her sons to be able to take over the Seljuk territory. So in the game, one of the player characters is a fairly high level magic user in the Lion and Dragon context, and he used his powers of glamour to help the breakout of Toghrul from his imprisonment in the city of Tabriz. And then later he conjured up an earth elemental to help Toghrul capture the capital city of Hamadan. And so I made a determination based on a reaction roll to see how, because that level of influence, that level of activity had to draw certain attention. So I want to see how much attention that had drawn to Anak Khatun as far as this particular player character was concerned. And the result of that was that in the session before this one, she tried to kill him. She had agents in the court of Isfahan where they were, and had him poisoned, and he nearly died, and so now he's especially wanting to take revenge on Anak Khatun, and that whole thing is going to develop in some pretty weird ways, I'm imagining. So it's that sort of stuff gets really interesting, actually, when the player characters do happen to, you got to be very careful in historical campaigns to note that player characters as a rule shouldn't be able to very easily alter world events necessarily, right? But if they do something notable enough, then you have to see well, what's the reaction, right? What happens out of that, So now there's like a death match going on between this player character and the Empress Libya of the Silk Road, you know.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got K999 or whatever. He says, "Will Taylor be making a factions rule supplement?" Well, that's probably
I mean,
an interesting idea.
if you guys, if there's desire for that, yeah, I could put out just a generic version of my faction system for Unknown Armies in like a day if I really tried hard. But
if it's only a day's work, then that's probably going to pay off no matter how many people go for it. You know?
Yeah, I could do that. The reason I hadn't done that already was just that I'd thought of Unknown Armies has almost has a bunch of really simplifying assumptions that you get to make about how factions work in it. Because in Unknown Armies, every faction is kind of on the exact same scale of really just being a small group of crazy but powerful people with a very weird goal. Because Unknown Armies has the fun little thing of, yes, there's tons of little cabals of people using their magical powers to try and change the world, but everyone with magic in Unknown Armies is a crazy person, and sanity has huge advantages.
I was always saying before Invisible College, which I now think is the most accurate depiction of occultism in any RPG. But before that, it was Unknown Armies, even though the magic of Unknown Armies has nothing to do with like real world occultism, or very little to do with it. But it's much more accurate than something like Mage the Ascension or stuff like that. Specifically for the reason that in Unknown Armies, there's kind of two things that they make very clear, which is one, that 90% of everything of all the occult and magic stuff that's written in what the modern era is just crap, right? It's just fake. And second, in that the people that go really deep into magic will end up, unless they're extremely careful about how they do it, becoming socially isolated weirdos, you know. So those are two very real things about modern occultism, you know.
Yes. To me, Unknown Armies is also like a metaphor for politics.
Yeah, in some ways, you do see similar things with people that get really into politics. Yeah, it's very true.
I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I could just release it and people. Yeah, I could just release that faction system and I'll just sort of append the thing to it of, hey, so this was originally made for something simpler. I don't know if you want to use it, but if you do want to use it, go right ahead. I kind of think of faction systems as needing to each be custom to their own setting, because a faction system is really a system for how the living world works. And
yeah, so you have to craft it to how factions would operate depending on the context of the setting, right? So like first, if you've got a pre-industrial setting, it's going to be very different than a post-industrial setting, you know?
Yes. So my Lords of game doesn't use the same faction system I use for my Unknown Armies game, because that would be silly. Lords of has a 3-tiered faction system where there's sub-city factions, which are like, hey, so the nobles that are the landholders in the city want this, and they're doing this for you. And then there's the city factions where they're like, hey, the city of Lagash is trying to, I don't know, build some monuments to appease some god. And then there's the gods. But obviously I'm not going to run it the same way that I would like, hey, so this all takes place in the city of Baltimore, and you're the unofficial unit of the police that handles the weird cases that no one else wants to think about. Anyways, the orchestra has failed to hold back the crab invasion.
Yeah.
We also for that game, which is still ongoing, my character is currently in solitary confinement in the Chesapeake Bay Correctional Facility. It hasn't gone well for us.
I see. Yeah, my mental trauma rules in Invisible College were kind of the initial inspiration was the trauma rules in Unknown Armies, right? Because I think that's a lot closer as a mechanic for that sort of thing, for how crazy you go and the way you go crazy if you get too deep into magical stuff. It's much more accurate than the like sanity points of Call of Cthulhu. So
Yeah.
there's another thing I was inspired by.
Yeah,
so Martin, sorry, go ahead.
No, continue.
Oh, I was going to say, Martin Bowman said, I would rather just see a timeline and keeping track of time. So by this time, X will happen. It works in COC if you track time properly. Well, it works in a lot of campaigns that have a historical and then like a timeline of events happening from the point of the beginning of the campaign onward, right? Which is one of the things I always find, like, to me that seems so self-evident, but so few games do that. Like, you see a lot of games where they'll sometimes have like the last 1,000 years of history of the setting, and then you're in the present day. Good luck. Like, one of the things I do in almost all my campaigns, starting with Arrows of Indra, with almost all my books, I mean, starting with Arrows of Indra, and I do it in Dark Albion, I do it in Sword and Caravan, and it's going to be in Baptism of Fire, is that you have a relatively brief previous timeline of events that you need to understand the buildup of how you get to the present day. And then you have usually a longer stretch of a timeline of future events that the DM can then choose to ignore if he really wants to. You can say, well, from here on in, it's anything goes. But if you don't, then this is a way for you to introduce campaign level events that are based on the history of the setting, and you would think that I get that in a fantasy game that you've made up, it means you'd have to make up the events, but that still is one very good way in many games where maybe there are a lot of games where you don't want to have to just have the DM determine these large scale events, or to have like some kind of complex system to do it, is to have a suggested timeline of future events, based on what you determined from the past of your setting that you created, even if it's completely unrelated to like historical or modern day contexts. That still seems like a really good idea to do in your fantasy setting. So if you're making a fantasy or a sci-fi setting, you should strongly consider doing that. Like, it's a good tool.
So I think what holds people back from doing that is how easily it can be done poorly.
True.
So I would say, actually, a number of people have done that. It's called an adventure path. And a GMPC.
That's true. That's on a limited scale, but yeah.
Yeah, and a GMPC and all the adventures that you and I both hate of everything has already been predetermined and the PC's actions don't matter, and the death of the sandbox and blah, 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 blah. And even for
an even better negative example of this is what you saw in late TSR, where in every setting they were putting out novels, and then they would change the setting based on things that happened in the novels, and usually it made the setting worse, because it was stuff that, but that's usually because it's being done in the context of, look, these great NPCs do this thing, and now it's the whole world is different, and it does seem to take away from player agency, right? It's a different thing if you're saying, well, there are these events that happen because of powers and potencies of like kingdoms and rulers and battles and things like that. What you don't want to do is have a group of super NPCs of Elminsters and Drizzt Do'Urdens going around doing the more epic stuff that your characters probably aren't able to do because of the rules themselves, like, because almost all of those characters in the novels end up being not exactly done to type of like what their character should be able to do as stats, you know?
I mean, okay, so it's worth noting that a lot of people do genuinely think of history and world events as mostly being things accomplished by great men and women, rather than things that happen because of institutions and impersonal forces and mentalities and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, this is partially you're just if you're not really well versed in history and you have sort of this pop culture understanding of the world, you might genuinely struggle to make something that's based off of powers and potentialities of kingdoms.
That's true if you don't have any kind of a historical education, let's say.
Yeah.
And also it's because if you're doing your future timeline and thinking of it like you're writing an epic novel, then you're going to end up using all the things that make novels more limited than real history, which is that things seem to follow a plot line that feels fake, right? So like one of the big mistakes someone could do if they're doing a future timeline for their setting is that all of the events are based on like these epic actions that people take instead of having a bunch of a number of random events, right? Like, oh, there's an earthquake in Azerbaijan, and that screws up the plans of one of these Turkish princes, you know, or you know, Richard the Lionheart is coming back to England and he's conquering France, and then suddenly he gets hit with a crossbow bolt and he dies of an infection a few days later. You know, like that sort of stuff. That's part of why like Games of Thrones was very popular, I think, is because it seemed like there were these events that happened that were totally unexpected because they don't follow what you expect the plot line to be, right? You think, oh, you know, what's his name? Ned Stark is going to be saved at the last moment. No, he gets decapitated, you know, because that happens in history. You have like, you know, Richard of York was kicking ass and then he gets ambushed and he dies, you know, and that's it, you know, like it's that sort of unpredictability that makes it feel more like history and less like a novel is a big part of what will make it a successful timeline, because then it feels like the great and the powerful are not actually entirely agents of their own greatness either, right? That there's a whole bunch of other stuff that can happen that gets in the way of that, you know?
So my favorite example of that sort of thing in history is, okay, so as you probably know, Imperial Russia in the late 1700s had this whole plan, and it was called the Greek Plan. And they were working with Austria to plot out how they were going to invade the Ottoman Empire with Austria and partition the Ottoman Empire's Greek possessions between them and Austria. Sorry, not the Greek possessions, all of their European possessions. Basically, everything we think of as the Balkans now, almost everything we think of as the Balkans now, between them and Russia, and Austria and Russia, and they were going to take their portion and create a new empire of Neo-Byzantium and put Catherine the Great's grandson on it. And the reason this didn't happen was because the plan was being put into motion in the 1780s, and whoopsie daisy, it turns out Napoleon exists.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're distracted.
Yeah, that sort of stuff happens all the time. You know, like in the timeline of Sword and Caravan, you have the Silk Road at that time was at the beginning of the timeline is occupied by like a half dozen different small powers that are viing vying with each other, and had been for like a few hundred years, right? And there was no centralized great force, right? And yet the interesting thing is that from that period of time, from about the around 1200 to 1220, gradually one of these different mini empires starts to get an advantage over all of its enemies, right? And so by about 1220, there's one force that controls almost all the Silk Road. And
is that why they thought they could execute his diplomats?
Might even, like, go and conquer. They might even conquer Baghdad, right, and everything else, right? Like they might end up becoming the next great power of the Middle East and everything. And then Genghis Khan shows up and kicks the shit out of them, you know, like, and then just devastates everything in his path, you know. So it's like,
are we talking about the
history more interesting. Sorry.
Are we talking about the Khwarazmians?
That's right. Yeah, the Khwarazmians. Yeah, with Muhammad II. Yeah, exactly.
Oh God!
So,
And is that why he was so high on his own power that he was like, yeah, it's a great idea to execute Genghis Khan's diplomats?
Yeah, pretty much, because I mean they kicked the shit out of everybody else, right? Like they conquered everything in their path, and they thought they were the greatest force that had been around in ages. And to be fair, they would have been if it wasn't that Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and then subsumed the Liao and most of the Jin Chinese, and suddenly he had an army that absolutely dwarfed everything in his path, and that his forces were much more united, so like they did not stand a chance, and they didn't realize what they were up against, right? Like they had no idea that was what they were facing. So yeah, so and that all happens in the campaign if you're running a certain caravan campaign, where like you could just imagine. I mean, like of course people could read the book or could know about history and know how that turns out, but in the context of in the campaign, you could have a group of player characters that are, if they end up becoming agents of the Khwarazmians, who think that everything's going fantastic, and then all of a sudden you start to hear about some crazy barbarians that are taking some cities over in the east, and like, well, we'll take them on, not a big deal,
Whatever, it's just some hillbilly. That's what they'll go.
Yeah. Largely, a lot of Genghis Khan's success is that he was constantly being underestimated because nobody expected it to work. Like nobody thought these guys were a real problem. There were several points where if they had understood the danger of it, right? Like the emperor of China, of Jin China, of northern China at that time, had an opportunity to stop Genghis Khan from, like, if he had allied with his vassals, which were the Liao, he could have potentially thwarted the unity of the Mongol tribes right then and there. And he said, no, fuck it. The Liao have been problematic. These guys are a bunch of barbarians that are causing trouble in our frontier. So let them kill each other, and they'll both weaken each other, and it'll be better for us, right? It turned out not to work out. Like that was not the right choice.
Yeah,
but I could see how it would have made sense to them at the time.
It's also worth noting that so Genghis Khan tends to get misunderstood by a lot of people who aren't well versed in the history of nomadic tribes on the Eurasian steppe, because they tend to assume that Genghis Khan was in some sense a very typical steppe leader who got unusually lucky or was unusually skilled, but he was actually more like a revolutionary against the steppe's political system. He's more like the steppe's.
You can see that by the early period of when he started to actually take over, which the first time he tried, he lost, right? and then later on when he tried again and eventually won, it was all the, like, let's say the, how would you call it, the establishment of the Mongols that was against him, because you're right, he wasn't a typical steppes leader.
He wasn't really. Arguably, he had some noble ancestry, I guess, but he grew up essentially the steppe equivalent of a homeless person.
Yeah, well, his father was killed early on, and then his family was impoverished.
Yeah. He had a huge number of policies that he came to power that were very atypical. Like a lot of, because he didn't have to depend on noble support because he'd already suborned them all. He was able to work with meritocracy.
That's right. He got he picked lords by merit, and they were like largely new men. They weren't necessarily the old guard that were.
Yeah.
That
so he was way more effective.
Rely on, he was done it by conventional means. Yeah, that's true. And I mean, he learned a lot in his exile, right? Because he was basically working as a mercenary for the Jin Chinese for a while, So he knew, first, he knew how they thought, and second, he realized how weak they actually were, So like,
yes,
that level of ambition would have been unusual, because like it was very normal for these guys, these different types of tribesmen in the northern border of China to go about doing some raids, right? But
Right.
it was only because he could see that, actually, hang on, these guys are much weaker than we think they are, that I think he was inspired to say, well, screw it, we're just going to conquer China,
So I want to note that there's actually a large history of pre-Chinggis steppe leaders not only knowing that the Chinese were weak, but knowing that they were weak to the point. What?
It's a cycle. I mean, the Jin Chinese themselves were not real Chinese. They were barbarians that saw how the Song Empire was weak and conquered the northern half of it, right? And before that, you had the Sulu and all of these different groups that were the same. It was the same thing,
Right. But but I think something gets missed because the Chinese tended to underreport it because it was very embarrassing for them. Is there's a number of cases of steppe nomads, not just knowing that the Chinese were weak, but actually having to go into Chinese territory to put down rebellions against the Chinese who were paying them tribute, which they would do for the entirely rational reason that steppe nomads tended to know that they were shitty administrators and assume that they just weren't going to be able to effectively control the territory, even if they knew they could conquer it. Also, steppe nomads tended to... So a normal settled population can mobilize about 2.5% to 5% of their population as combatants, whereas steppe nomads can mobilize about 25% of their population as combatants. So even if steppe nomads are massively outnumbered by the settled population, which they tended to be, they could still mobilize comparable or larger armies. But the problem with that is you're then using your entire population as your army, and any battlefield losses you take are going to be much more devastating to you in the long term because you don't really have a backbench. So there's that. There's also how, steppe nomads, like as a big benefit to themselves, didn't really have to have a supply line because their supply line was my horses and my sheep go everywhere I go. They eat grass. I eat them and their milk. So they could kind of go wherever. But if they just sort of get to a place where they can't graze their horses, they're fucked. So like there was a huge, I don't know. There's a huge amount of complications here that I feel like I've totally lost the plot of anything about RPGs, and I'm just sort of talking about steppe nomad economics.
It's a topic you really like. I know that from your
tweets. I wish at some point I'm going to come back around and finish Beneath an Endless Sky, but I could never get that game to work.
So some comments here. Calvinani says the Mongols were like the Inquisition of their time. Yeah, nobody expected them.
Yeah.
Lord Sathar says history kind of plods along, usually according to social forces, until you get some weirdo that comes up with a killer app that changes everything. Hence the great man theory. Well, see, as a historian, I would say that I definitely believe in the great man theory, as it's called, in that exact sort of context that Sathar is talking about, that there is unquestionably people, but then there's also like events, right? There's the it's black swans, I guess you could say, like these unpredictable events, which sometimes take the form of a person, sometimes they take the form of a natural disaster, sometimes it's other stuff that ends up causing massive change that was not predictable based on just the ongoing process of social forces. So yeah.
I finally remembered what my entire point with Genghis Khan was.
Okay. Go ahead.
The Jin would reasonably have expected Genghis Khan to sign a treaty with them where the Jin paid Genghis tribute in exchange for Chinggis's military support, and Chinggis's people would mostly have ended up spending any tribute that was paid to them at markets controlled by the Jin anyways. So it's essentially just the Jin giving border provinces weird subsidies and getting military support at the same time. Having a pet barbarian on your frontier is actually a really good deal when it's not Genghis Khan, but Genghis Khan had a huge personal grudge against nobles of any stripe, settled or steppe, and would go out of his way to kill them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And you know, but the Jin, if anyone should have known better, it kind of was them, because only, you know, a few generations ago, they were the nomads that came in and took everything too, right?
Yeah.
And it's notable that when they invaded China, there were a large number of these other border tribes of other nomads that joined, you know, that had been working with the Chinese, or with the Jin rather, let's call them the Jin, and switched over, right? But there were also a large number of Han Chinese that switched over to Genghis Khan, just because they fucking hated the Jin, right? Because they saw them as their oppressor. So yeah. All right. So I think we're at like the starting to wind down phase of the live stream. But
sure,
I wanted to know if there's anything more you wanted to tell us about your current products, about if there's anything that we had left out about your undead campaign, or about anything else that you want to promote here right now and tell us about.
Follow me on itch. Take a look at the Evil Undead campaign. It's pay what you want, because I'm currently just feeling like I want more people to pay attention to me and get ready to buy stuff from me in the future, so I'm willing to just give stuff away right now. Because I think if you get my stuff for free, you'll like it enough to pay for it in the future. What else? I am.
Pay what you want is a good deal. Yeah. Pay what you want is a good deal. So
yes. And you know, don't be afraid to just have what you want be zero, and just have it be you're checking out my work and seeing if I'm actually as good as I say I am.
I will post in the post edit of the replay of this live stream. I'll put a link to your undead campaign HIO link, so that people will be able to go there.
Yeah. What else? I'm currently holding playtesting for Lords of Sumer. If you go onto Twitter, you can contact me there at Forest at Depth. And apply to play in that. Gosh, can't think of a whole lot more.
Okay, all right. Christopher Johnson is asking, I said I answered this at the start of the live stream, but I can answer it now in case there's people that missed it. He asks, what's up with the RPG site? The site's been down for maintenance since Saturday. Well, we've had a technical problem that you know, the tech administrator Brett is working on. We hope that it'll be back up within the next 24 hours, and unfortunately there was no really easy way to communicate this to everyone, because you know, the RPG site has a lot of people in it, and I think only some of them follow me on Twitter. I probably should have put something up there, but you know, I was expecting it to get fixed a lot faster. We both were, right? So so that's the only reason why we didn't make any kind of an announcement, but it should be back up pretty soon. Yeah. And Burner Account says, why didn't the Mongols go into India? Well, curiously, one of the interesting reasons for why they didn't really go into India was that, you know how I told you, I was talking earlier about how how there was this guy, the Khwarezmian emperor, who was very, very powerful, and then he got his ass kicked by the Mongols. Well, that guy's son managed to survive, and he ended up being one of the few people that resisted the Mongols. He fought them in Afghanistan with a bunch of Afghan warriors, and actually had like the first real battle that Genghis had seriously lost during that Silk Road campaign. But then they fought him in a second battle that they won, right at the border of India, and he fled to India. And they eventually sent people after him because they really wanted him dead. But by then he'd managed with a very small number of men to take control of a few cities in India, and he actually fought them off. You know, he beat them back. He actually got one of the leaders of one of these Mongol bands that had been sent to kill him. He defeated him in battle and then made him into a vassal of his. You know, and that guy ended up continuing to cause trouble for the Mongols for quite a few decades. Eventually, they killed him, but basically, he was one of the reasons why they didn't go in there. Also, like, you know, at that time, the Gurids, who had been on the Silk Road, but they'd lost all of the territories of the Silk Road to the Khwarezmians, they were still in charge of the Delhi Sultanate, which was fairly powerful, you know. And I think that they were more interested in continuing heading to the towards the west rather than going into India, and I think that was the main reason.
I hadn't heard of
part of it was because they had initial difficulties. Yeah,
I hadn't heard of all that, and that makes the later history of the foundation of the Mughal Empire very, very ironic.
Yeah, well, it was what was the name of the guy? I've got him here. This was Muhammad II's son, his name was Jalal-ad-Din. And yeah, he ended up being a major thorn in the side of the Mongols for about 2 decades. That you can find the biography of Jalal-ad-Din and Genghis Khan and Muhammad II and a whole bunch of other guys in my Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road source book for Sword and Caravan, which is a collection of biographies and stats for all of the NPCs mentioned in the Silk Road. It also includes an expanded timeline with adventure queues. And it has the much demanded, I should say, assassin class for Lion and Dragon. That everybody, when Sword and Caravan came out, and it had assassins as like in the monster section, but it didn't have them as a PC class. Everybody wanted that, and so I said, okay, well, fuck it, I'll put it in Heroes and Villains, because I don't think they make good player characters if you're playing them historically straight, but if everyone wants it, it's in there. And you also get some very interesting high-tech song China weaponry, which was another group that held off against the Mongols for a lot longer. It wasn't until Kublai Khan that they got their asses finally kicked. So yeah, check out Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road. It's a great source book for either Sword and Caravan, or for any campaign where you want to have, you know, that kind of Middle Eastern style of characters. That you can plug in those NPCs to your own settings, yeah, so it's a very good product to check out. All right, there's my shilling for the evening. Besides that, I would say, as far as commentary and promotion is, be sure to check out all my products as usual. The links will be in the description below, and especially check out while you're waiting for Baptism of Fire to show up, remember I am currently publishing every 2 weeks the Pundit Files. The latest one is Pundit Files number 9, which is the largest issue that I've come out with yet. I think it's about 22 or 23 pages long. It's called the Invisible College 1930s campaign. So if you like the Invisible College, but you want to play it, instead of playing it in the modern era, you want to play it in the very interesting period between the two world wars. The 1930s campaign gives you all the material that you need, including a timeline of real world events and also occult events, and modifiers to the game in order to run the campaign of Invisible College in that period. And the Red Room is offering a special where if you buy the Pundit Files #9, you get a 50% off discount on their Wretched Interbellum source book, which is their source book for 1930s adventuring. You know, it's got all the classic kind of pulp elements to it in the Wretched style. So be sure to check that out. You can only get this on the Red Room. So go to the Red Room's website, and that issue of the Pundit Files, even though it's, you know, way bigger than most of my issues, is still available for the low price of about $3.50. Okay, so for $3.50, you can have Pundit Files #9 or any of the other issues. Be sure to check it out. Okay, anything else to add here? Matthew Sinan says, how do you tell what is Lion and Dragon supplements? Well, I guess I can tell you, right? Everything that Dom Publishing published is a Lion and Dragon supplement in a certain way, right? So that's Lion and Dragon, Dark Albion, and Cults of Chaos, right? And also the adventure, The Ghost of Jack Cade. And then everything that Mad Scribe Press has published of mine is also a Lion and Dragon supplement. So that's Sword and Caravan, Heroes and Villains, Wilderlands, and Social Encounters on the Silk Road, which is the source book that's not really for Sword and Caravan. It's for everything that you can use it for, regulating social encounters, like social interactions, without using like a social skill thing, like I roll my +10 diplomacy, but instead it's based on the reaction roll system of old school D&D, right? And it lets you adapt that system to like what your characters are role playing, but also to different factors involved and to what type of interaction you have. So there's rules there for intimidation, haggling, for dealing with wild animals, for debates, for lawsuits, for all kinds of stuff, right? For seduction, information gathering. So it's I think a mechanic that helps the DM determine social role playing without turning it into like just a mechanized system. So all of those are Lion and Dragon supplements. And then the Pundit Presents series has some stuff that is and some stuff that is for Last Son, right? But you can get the omnibuses, the Old School Companion 1, which is all like supplemental rules and flavor stuff. And then the Old School Companion 2, which are medieval authentic adventures for Lion and Dragon, okay? Steambub says, how's the Gonzo Companion 2 looking? Well, the Gonzo Companion is, the Gonzo Fantasy Companion is actually the second Last Son product, right? So the first one is World of Last Son. The second one is the Gonzo Fantasy Companion. World of Last Son tells you all about the setting of the Last Son and its different parts. The Gonzo Fantasy Companion is full of mechanics for running Gonzo games. Now, it's all frub stuff from my Last Son campaign, but you can use it for other Gonzo weird fantasy stuff, right? So it has all the generators for weird races, for robots, for ancient complexes, for talking animals, for weird items, and all kinds of other really interesting stuff that you can plug and play into any of your OSR materials. So, okay, I hope that answers those questions. Any final thoughts, Taylor? Anything else you wanted to say before we finish off?
I think I've said all there is to say.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I know that this was we had to work out the time difference between us because we're at basically opposite ends of the globe, but I think it worked out pretty well. And
worked out great.
I look forward to seeing your incoming products, and I think everybody should check out Taylor's games and also Taylor's Twitter feed, because like I said, every time I look at one of those tweets, it ends up giving me ideas, especially if you're like somebody who's interested in game or setting design. You know, it's a good thing to look at. So yeah, check that out. And I guess that's everything for today. I can't tell you when the next live stream is going to be. As you know, I don't do it at a set day or you know, on a weekly basis or anything like that. But I will let you guys know ahead of time. So if you haven't done so already, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Even then, it doesn't always tell you, but at least there's a better chance that you'll get notified that the live stream is happening. Okay. And thank you everybody for watching. I think we had a very good show, and we'll see you next time, whenever that is. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.